Howdy, folks. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today for you folks, I have a brand new Warhammer 40k Wrath and Glory video because today, folks, I'm going to be taking time and discussing a little bit of background information and discuss the hierarchy of the Imperium of Man. Now, with that being said, some of this stuff is only going to get highlighted, like the Inquisition, even though they're towards the top of the hierarchy. Um, I'm only going to skim over them because I'm going to put out a video dedicated to just the Inquisition itself. My primary goal is to pretty much only talk about the very top, which essentially is going to be the Emperor himself and the High Lords of Terra. And I do have to say, when you're looking at it, it's a really complex machine that definitely should not work. There's just too many cogs, in my opinion. But, you know, especially with the fact that you got a galaxy spanning empire, and it's just in everything is just really complex, really complicated. You got cogs on top of cogs, and basically the machine has to break down at some point, which it does actually quite often within the realm of Warhammer 40k. But for some odd reason, somehow, it all just works. I'm also going to be skipping out on the militant arms here of the Imperium because basically down the road, I'm also going to cover the various militant arms of the Imperium because, yeah, the Imperium is just huge. Realistically, for me to cover the whole Imperium, it would probably take several hours, at least to get into any sort of deep detail about the Imperium, let alone I'm only going to be glossing over it, and it's still going to end up being several videos to gloss over the various different factions. But the goal here is to give you a better understanding of the Imperium itself, so that way you can better exercise the Imperium, if you will, within your Warhammer 40k Wrath and Glory campaign. Now, I think the real place to start is going to be the Big E himself, as essentially he had put the Imperium together back during the days of the Great Crusade, before he pretty much got trapped onto the Golden Throne itself because of the Horus Heresy. Nowadays, essentially, he spends a majority of his time, okay, let me correct that, all of his time sitting on the big chair and pretty much inactively ruling the Imperium. But there's still very important things that the Emperor does himself. The big one is he powers the Astronomicon, which essentially allows the Imperium to use warp travel itself. It helps guide ships through the warp. However, even though essentially he's a big battery for the Astronomicon, well, somebody's got to feed that battery, and it takes roughly 1,000 psychers per day to essentially recharge the Emperor, I guess you could say, and keep him alive, keep him going, keep the Astronomicon going, which is the big thing. Now, he does from time to time communicate through visions, dreams, sending psychic messages, if you will, psychic visions to the various psychers within the Imperium itself, especially some of the more powerful ones. But essentially, what it comes down to is he's not really the ruler of the Imperium. Well, I guess kind of maybe he is. He's kind of in a weird spot because he's the ruler of the Imperium, but realistically, he's not the active ruler of the Imperium. So that it's kind of a messy thing if you really want to go with that. And then, of course, within the hierarchy itself is the Custodes. Now, realistically, when you look at the chart of the hierarchy of the Imperium, the Custodes are actually kind of lower. They're kind of equal to the Space Marines and the Imperial Guard, or the Astra Militarum and the Imperium Navy and so on. But realistically, they are the royal bodyguards of the Emperor himself. And actually, their word holds a lot of sway because essentially their word is treated as the word of the Emperor. So it's kind of a weird thing that they're a little bit lower on the hierarchy of the Imperium, but yet seem to hold a lot of power within the Imperium. Even the basic custodes, compared to anyone else in the Imperium, their word seems to hold a lot of power. But realistically, when you look at the chain of Thanes, the Inquisition would essentially be next in the chain, because essentially no one is above the Inquisition. Technically, not even the Emperor himself is above investigation from the Inquisition. I'm not sure if any Inquisitors ever launched an investigation against the Emperor. It's kind of an interesting concept now that I sit here and think about it. But realistically, like I said earlier, I'm only going to gloss over the Inquisition because essentially I want to just do a special video breaking down the Inquisition, because the Inquisition is a very complex machine within the complex machine of the Imperium. However, let's dive into the Lords of Terra themselves. Now, these are the active rulers of the Imperium. They decide the tithes. They decide essentially what happens from a top-down control standpoint. They decide the laws. Everything else. With all that being said, though, the High Lords of Terra, even though they are very powerful, they're also notorious for being both corrupt and incompetent. At least certain members of it over the millennium. And when I say corrupted, I don't mean corrupted by chaos. I mean in the more traditional sense of corrupt. You know, kind of like most of the government. But moving on. Each seat of the High Lords of Terra essentially represents a different part of the Imperium at whole, as essentially a different cog in the machine. And they actively rule. However, with that being said, because of their corruption and their sheer incompetence, it's actually led to various assassinations as well as military campaigns against the High Lords of Terra themselves, or even specific members of the council. Now, the first thing I want to do is just discuss the 9 lords of the Council of Terra. The first one you have is the Lord of the Administratum, a representative. You also get a representative of the Inquisition. You have the Achillearch of the Adeptus Ministratum, the Grand Lawman himself, the Grand Marshal of the Adeptus Arbites, the Patrinovel of the Navigators, which I guess that one makes sense because, essentially without the Navigators, the Imperium pretty much goes absolutely nowhere. The Master of the Astronomicon, which, once again, pretty much for the same reasons. There is also the Fabricator General of Mars because, well, yeah, pretty much he's the leader of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and essentially without him, basically the Imperium's got no guns. The Grand Master of the Officio Assassinorum, and pretty much I think that's because everybody's afraid of him. I would be. And the Master of the Astra Telepaths. Now, that's the 9 permanent seats. So there's always a member of those groups in those seats as part of the Council of Terra. However, there's also 3 additional seats on the Council of Terra, and those remaining seats are, if you will, a little bit wishy-washy. It shakes up from time to time of who is on that seat, and realistically, none of them are permanent seats. To start with, there's the Lord Commander Solar, the Lord Commander of the Astra Militarum, the High Admiral of the Imperial Navy, the Holy Synod of Terra, the Abbot Centaurum of the Adeptus Sororita, which she's essentially the grand leader of the Sisters of Battle. There is also the Captain General of the Custodes, And mostly he doesn't have a permanent seat because, well, usually the captain general of the Custodes really doesn't want to be bothered by politics in the first place. The chancellor of the estate Imperium, I'm not sure who that is. Is that like the top realtor in the Imperium? I'm not sure. The speaker of the Chartist captains, which essentially he is the Lord of Trade. And then you have the Lord Constable of the Synoptica, which essentially pretty much just overwatches things when it comes to the activities of the Council of Terra itself. Mostly that has to do with rewinding the clock at some point where a member of the High Lords of Terra actually tried to usurp the Imperium and particularly the Emperor himself. But as you can tell, going over the list, each member of the High Lords of Terra, of the Council of Terra, if you will, has something different and important that they bring to the table because they represent each of the various factions within the Imperium itself. The only one that I'm aware of that doesn't really have, per se, a representative might be the Adeptus Astartes. I'm not sure, because if I remember correctly, Guilliman himself is Lord Solar, but Lord Solar has also been a human several times over the millennia. Either ways, now there's been a huge shakeup when it comes to the High Lords of Terra because of Guilliman's return, and essentially it's led to several changes of what groups are getting represented on the High Lords of Terra and who is members of the High Lords of Terra, because essentially when Guilliman returned, he pretty much got rid of a lot of the corrupt politicians right off the bat. Actually, the High Lords of Terra that was there when Guilliman awoken, actually tried to have him assassinated, which ended up not working out. And they also tried to use the Minotaurs chapter against him, which also really didn't work out at the end of the day. But either ways, huge shakeup when Guilliman returns. But either ways, folks, that's really all I'm going to discuss with today's video. If anybody would like any additional information, maybe comment down below and I can give you some additional information that I know. This might be a subject I'm actually going to revisit within various videos to kind of get a little bit of a deeper dive, especially within the various offices and leadership, if you will, that is part of the Council of Terra. But either way, folks, hopefully you all enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for tuning in, and have yourselves a wonderful day.
Gentlemen, this is Democracy Manifest.